Hello, everyone. Owing to some positive feedback I got from my father about my October reads, I have decided to make a video about my November reads. Notes on Nationalism. This is basically just a long essay by George Orwell. It's him making sense of Nazism that he saw. Down and out in Paris and London. Never read a George Orwell book till this year. Now I've read two in a relatively brief period of time. This is about him and his working class self in Paris and in London, very early into his journalism career. This is labeled under both fact and fiction in some places. In like one website, it'll be fact, the other it'll be fiction. He says that all the events that he saw really, or that he writes, really did happen, just not all to him. James Baldwin, The Fire Next Time, sort of a race reckoning book by a guy who's considered one of the best authors America produced. This book, I'm not quite sure how you pronounce that. I know Boko Haram. We probably all remember this, that incident that happened at the Nigerian school where the girls disappeared. This book is about that. The war against civilians. This looks at the costs of the current war we fought, or just got out of, really, in Afghanistan. America's longest war lasted, I believe, 20 years. Mortality by Christopher Hitchens. Interesting perspective from this guy. Very witty. Christopher Hitchens, master of, social commentary. And interesting perspective, devout atheist, if you can be such a thing. Darkness Visible is about a person coping with depression. I believe the person's occupation is that he's a writer. This is again going to be nonfiction. Well, they pretty much all are this month. A Rumor of War by Caputo. This is interesting because this guy went to Vietnam as an officer in 65, I think. Sorry, I'm a bit congested and stuffy. And he then went back a decade later and was one of those people who had to be evacuated out of Saigon immediately. And when he went back, though, he was as a war correspondent. So, Marine to war correspondent, very interesting perspective. Man's Search for Meaning. Definitely the most popular book I've read this month. Certainly the most well known. Viktor Frankl talking about people's experiences and how you can find optimists even in death camps. And basically, it's not so much tragedy in man's life, it's inability of some people to make sense of it. That's the problem. Amusing Ourselves to Death. This is Neil Postman, who, if you don't know who he is, essentially he's an American educator, got his PhD in education, lived in New York, was a college professor, I believe, and he looked at how television was sort of getting itself into American lives, and he argues that it didn't just change our opinions about things, it actually changes the way we perceive things. Very fascinating read by him, and of course nowadays with people constantly glued to their phones, it's even much more interesting. How the Irish Saved Civilization. Essentially, this is just a breakdown on how the Roman alphabet was able to continue long after the fall of the Roman Empire, certainly after the fall of the western portion of the Roman Empire. Neil Postman, again, The Disappearance of Childhood. This is a work that was mentioned in a book I read a couple years ago called Summer of Night. And in it, they talk about how The children are now being marketed to by corporations and by companies. The book tackles the very difficult subject of the sexualization of youth in America. It also tackles other things as well. A very good read, and again, from somebody who is. I consider his works to be philosophical works, even though I don't think Neil Postman himself would very much like to be called a philosopher. Last book of the month, Carl Sagan, The Dragons of Eden, Speculations on the Evolution of Human Intelligence. Very fascinating read by him, and those of you who are fans of the Harry Potter franchise, be ye fans of the books or be ye fans of the movies, I find it fascinating that there might have actually been something approaching parcel tongues at one point. So, Carl Sagan, definitely a good author. I've liked every book I've read by him. If you are somebody who doesn't have a lot of time to read, but you like Carl Sagan and the scientific perspective, read The Pale Blue Dot. Good book. Thank you.